Stuart Holbrook has spent his life in the world of collectors. As president of Therials, the world's leader in the auction of antique dolls and figurative art for over 30 years, he's managed the often personal and always wild world of collecting and collectors. His market expertise and knowledge of trends comes to life in The Curious Collector, where he shares his experience and experiences in real-life stories, alongside sage advice on how to build great collections within the happy life of a collector.
Welcome back, everybody, to episode 23 of The Curious Collector. I'm Stuart Holbrook, and with you today in a wonderful conversation I have been so excited to have with Dr. Sara Woodbury of the Berry Art Museum in Norfolk, Virginia. And this museum is... well, it serves two purposes. For doll collectors, what a wonderful tribute to the doll as a work of art in a beautiful themed permanent gallery that is in place in an actual art museum. And this is an amazing thing for everybody across the world to see dolls in this context, and is so important for what I like to call the others who are not really doll experts, doll collectors, or might even have a bias towards dolls in not understanding their stories, to reaching them. In essence, what they're doing is validating the subject, but also validating you as collectors. And I love this, and I'm so happy to have Dr. Woodbury with us today to give us her thoughts on not only the Berry Art Museum and Carolyn Berry and Richard Berry, who were the visionaries behind this incredible museum and have given so much of themselves over these past 10 years since the original concept came about, but to explain from her place in her world of an art historian and a curator of art for a museum, how dolls fit into that conversation. Dr. Sara Woodbury, thank you so much for coming on The Curious Collector with us here today. And I know you as Sara because I've known you for a while. And but I like saying Dr. Sara because you really put a lot into your work and to achieve this accomplishment in your life. And I'm so happy you could join us and tell us a little bit about yourself and the Berry Art Museum and some discussions on dolls and how they intersect within the art world. So welcome here.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right. So tell us a little bit, and I mean, I know quite a bit about you in our discussions and talks at the Berry Art Museum over the past few years, but tell our listeners a little bit about your background and education and how you found your way to the Berry Art Museum.
All great questions, Stuart. And yes, more than happy to talk. The short answer that I always like to tell people is, so I started out studying Northern Renaissance art, and now I play with dolls. And the reason why I phrase it that way is that any art historian's journey tends to be long and meandering, and you never know what you're going to end up working with. And that's where the fun of it comes from. So I will admit, I was not much of a doll person growing up. I was a dinosaur kid, and my interests, fluctuated every year. Like one year I wanted to be a paleontologist, the next year I wanted to be a baker and whatnot. But eventually I settled on art history. And that was my major in college. And that was what I also got my master's degree in. So my undergraduate degree is from Lake Forest College. I, again, focused on Northern Renaissance art there. I wrote a thesis on a 16th century German Franciscan painting that nobody would want to read. I don't think even I would nowadays.
Oh, gosh. I'll read it. Send it to me.
All right.
Yeah.
And then for my master's, I did that right after my undergraduate. I ended up going to Williams College out in Massachusetts and still interested in early modern art at that point. And this is a great conversation starter. My master's thesis was about 17th century Dutch tooth pulling scenes. Because believe it or not, that's a genre unto itself. It is.
We're learning something here. All right. For the dentists out there, I'm sure they would be very intrigued by this.
Oh, you have no idea how many conversations I've had with dentists, just as a warm-up in terms of, so, what do you write about?
I love it.
Paintings of people getting their teeth pulled out. You don't say.
They actually did this? They did paintings of people getting their teeth pulled out?
Yes, and
Why?
there are more of them out there than you think. Well, that was the question I attempted to answer, and I'm not sure I did, but I was happy with what I offered, because basically the interpretations of these paintings up to the time that I was researching them was, well, they're allegorical. It's about be careful about who you trust to do things with you and whatnot. I was like, okay, I get that in terms of be aware of charlatans and whatnot, but you could show that in any other way. Why fixate so much on people getting their teeth ripped out? So that's what I was focusing on, was less the symbolic meaning and more of the experience of depicting pain. And basically I argued, well, the patient can only feel it, but they can't see it. The dentist can see the pain, but they can't feel it. And together they have a whole experience, or something to that effect. It got me the degree.
Okay. 17th century teeth pulling, and it led to this. Okay, I love it. And
yes.
So what were the expressions on there? Were they painful? I just have to know this. Were they always painful, or were some people calm?
Honestly, what you tended to see was kind of befuddlement, like, oh, so this is happening.
Okay.
Honestly, it was kind of hard to see the expressions because their mouth was open, so that was all you could see.
Oh my gosh. This is incredible. I love this story. That's a fabulous story of how you came in. So continue on.
So my original plan was to go straight on to the PhD, but by this point, I'd been in school for 6 years and I needed a break. So that's what I did. And it was originally going to be a year or two, but I ended up getting a job with insurance and benefits. And that was, speaking of tooth pulling scenes, having dental insurance was really nice. So it ended up being 8 years before I went back to school. And over the course of those 8 years, my interests shifted quite a bit. In terms of museums, that was really how I got into the Barry Art Museum, because my position essentially was a result of networking. So after I finished up at Williams, I had a couple of internships in Wyoming and Dallas, and then I had a 2-year curatorial fellowship at Shelburne Museum up in Vermont, just south of Burlington. Have you been to Shelburne?
I have, actually. I was going to tell you they have an interesting collection of dolls as well.
They sure do. Well, that was my first experience working with dolls and automatons, was with that collection. Mm-hmm. So I was only there 2 years. Again, it was a fellowship rather than a full-time position, but while I was there, I helped work on the inaugural exhibition for the museum's year-round exhibition space, the Pizzagalli Center for Art and Education. So that building was under construction when I was there. And for that first show, we decided to focus on the permanent collection through the lenses that Electra Havemeyer-Webb liked to collect, because her collecting tenets were color, pattern, whimsy, and scale. So each of the co-curators, my supervisors and myself, took a different section. And I took the whimsy section. And sure enough, one of the pieces I featured in there was the clown magician automaton that they've got.
Okay.
So that was my first experience with dolls and automatons. But then for the next several years, I shifted again. I ended up getting a full-time position at the Roswell Museum out in New Mexico. Yes, it's that Roswell. No, I did not work at the UFO Museum.
Okay.
I worked at the art museum up the street.
So they have an art museum in Roswell.
They do, and it is very good.
Interesting.
Although I do have to say, just a brief aside, they're not open at the moment because in October, you're not going to believe this, they had a 500-year flood in Roswell, and the museum was one of the sites affected.
That's horrible. Oh my gosh. That's terrible.
Yes, so they're temporarily closed, working on conserving the collection. But I will say, if you get a chance to go to their website and check out the collection, it's very good. They have an excellent collection of works by Peter Hurd and Henriette Wyeth and other artists based in the Southwest.
Wonderful. And you can get aliens and art in one day.
You absolutely can. I mean, you can literally walk from one to the other.
It's fantastic. I love it. I love it. Which is kind of like an interesting connection of how the Barry Art Museum is with dolls intersecting with art. Not that dolls are aliens, but bringing out that there is a space for everything within context, and there is a connection to everything. So you came to Barry Art Museum eventually. And
yes. So there's one more step in the journey. So at the end of 5 years in Roswell, I was ready for a change. I had just finished a major show, co-curating it with the Michener Art Museum in Pennsylvania. And it was a retrospective on Peter Hurd and Henriette Wyeth. It was really well received and whatnot. And I was at this point in my career, it's like where I was thinking, well, I can stay here for the next 20 or 30 years, or I can do something else. And I decided I was ready to do something else. While I had been at Roswell, I ended up getting interested in this WPA New Deal art program called the Federal Community Arts Center Project, because the Roswell Museum opened in 1937 as one of these federal art centers. And I decided I wanted to research that program and art access more deeply. So I decided it was time to go back for the PhD, and I ended up going to William and Mary in the American Studies program. So that's what put me in Virginia. But then how I got involved with the Barry Art Museum was in 2020. I was getting ready to complete my comprehensive exams, and I was in a bit of a conundrum. William and Mary, in addition to their regular funding package, had offered me a 2-year recruitment fellowship to sweeten the pot, so to speak. But it was only good for the first 2 years, and it was about to expire. So I was finding myself $5,000 short on my annual budget, and I was starting to wonder, what am I going to do to make that up? Do I need to start walking dogs? Do I need to start babysitting? What am I going to do? And out of the blue, I get a text from Corey Rogers, the chief curator up at Shelburne Museum, who had been my immediate supervisor when I was there and is still a good friend of mine. And he had said, Sarah, call me. I think I have a project for you. And he did. It turned out that Charlotte Potter Kasich, who was the interim executive director at the Barry Art Museum at the time, had reached out to him asking if he'd be interested in working on a show involving the Barry Art Museum's automaton collection. And Corey's response immediately had been, no, I already have a full-time job. I manage a department. I don't have time to help you. But I know someone who can, and she lives an hour away. And that's how I got to meet the Barry Art staff. And so I always tell students, that's the power of networking.
Exactly. But that's quite a journey, really. I didn't realize there were all of these steps that led to Barry. And I always imagined that you had walked into Barry Art Museum with kind of cold knowledge of dolls. That is, you had really no connection or understanding of it. But now I've learned you did. At Shelburne, I know they have an incredible collection. And so you had some experience working with them, and you had some initial ideas as to their context and stories that they tell, the history that they have. But you got into Barry Art Museum and you saw the collections. And as I discussed in the intro, the Barry is not a doll museum. It is an art museum. And you have many different genres represented. But this is the only museum in the world that would call itself an art museum that I know of that has a dedicated gallery specifically towards the subject of figurative art and dolls. So what were your thoughts when you walked in and saw this? It's a permanent collection. It's not an exhibit.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great question. And I'll start by qualifying my previous experience with dolls a little bit. So yes, I did have some experience with the dolls and automaton at Shelburne, but it wasn't my primary focus when I was there. I had been hired to work with the paintings and print collection, and the dolls were really adjacent to the main work I did. But that said, I still found those automatons really engaging and found any excuse that I could to research them when I had free time in between looking up print artists and whatnot. So in some ways, seeing the Barry Art collection was a bit of a homecoming, a little bit. In terms of the content, it reminded me of Shelburne. But probably the biggest difference I noted was how it was displayed. And this was when it was still in a chronological format. So there were more dolls out on view than there are now. But even then, it was fewer dolls than what I had seen at other museums. So like Shelburne, for instance, has a doll collection, but it describes itself as a collection of collections. It's not an art museum per se. It's material culture. You've got other institutions like the Strong Museum of Play or whatnot, where the objects are really presented as artifacts of history. I hadn't really seen the dolls presented as sculpture before. And what I mean by that is you have fewer pieces out on view so that you have more one-on-one time with the objects as you would with works of sculpture, and they're lit in such a way that you really bring attention to their physical features, their construction, the way that they're put together and whatnot, the process, as well as their role in society. And I thought that was really interesting. And as I started getting more involved with the museum and researching individual doll makers like Jameau and Simon and Halbig and whatnot, and really getting to know the processes behind them, what really intrigued me was the connections that I could see with certain artistic processes. Like when I was reading about bisque dolls, for example, I could visualize the process of casting ceramics, because one of the things that I got to do in Roswell was they have this wonderful clay studio. And as an employee, I got to take art classes for free there. So I learned how to throw pottery. So I was able to visualize, the process of casting the slip. Or the idea of casting multiples made me think of printmaking, because when I was at Shelburne, I took printmaking classes to better understand those processes. So while it might have initially surprised me to say, well, that's an unusual interpretation, it didn't seem that far-fetched to me once I started learning how these pieces were actually made. And especially once I started reading about the hand-painted details and the handmade eyes and whatnot, I was like, these are all processes you would see in other media.
Mm-hmm. That's incredible, because you are one of the very few, in the way you're describing it, very few art historians or curators of art out there that recognizes these processes and how it intersects with art. So I kind of want to address the 800-pound gorilla in the room today, and that is, as an art historian and curator, do you consider the doll as an art form?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, because at the very least, there are plenty of artists out there who created dolls, specifically as sculpture. So you have art dolls from Dorothy Heiser and Deweese Cochran, for example. But even if you're looking at more mass-produced objects, there are so many intersections between those objects and working artists. Jameau is a great example in terms of hiring artists to sculpt the models that would serve as the basis for the faces.
Carrier Balouse, in this case, as an example. Yeah.
Oh, right. Absolutely. What intrigues me especially is thinking about the hundreds, if not thousands, of anonymous women who painted those details. Yes, they are poured from a certain mold. They are a replica, but there's also this unique quality in the hand-painted details. Each woman, each artist brought her own touch. And again, that makes me think of prints, where you have an edition, they're all identical prints in that they're pulled from the same plate, but each impression is also unique because you have to go through that process again and again, and you can change with each one how much ink you apply, how much you wipe off. There are still these creative decisions being made, and I see that as being very analogous to dolls.
You are by far the greatest voice I've ever heard in describing this and how they connect to art. And this is incredible as well, because that's what the Barrie Art Museum is doing in context, is allowing the narrative to be told of these pieces in that manner to the general public. Doll museums in the past were wonderful. There were great doll museums. Rosalie Weil Museum of Doll Art was fantastic. But I think where it failed to reach who I call the others was that they were doll museums. They weren't telling the story of art. And this forces people to come in and interact with the dolls in a way that is surprising to them, I think. And the way you tell this story is incredible. And I'm going to venture to go further. I mean, I'm biased in this, but I'll venture to take dolls even to a higher level of art, in that there's two other connections. It's three-dimensional, number one, which is truly unique in that it represents our human experience. So three-dimensional art form that represents the human experience. But then I'm trying to think, is there any other art form out there that has a connection to nostalgia as well? I mean, people don't feel nostalgic about, I don't want to say tooth-pulling paintings, but any painting.
I mean,
yeah, exactly. But I mean, to a painting, do you feel nostalgia is at play in people collecting those? You mentioned prints, things like that. I don't feel nostalgia in that, but with dolls, you have that other incredible pull. So not only art, but nostalgia.
Oh, absolutely. And I would agree in that dolls have this aura of nostalgia that is quite distinct from other art forms. And I think, again, it relates to our own experiences. Even for someone like myself who didn't necessarily grow up with a lot of dolls, I still had them. So I could still have that connection, the experience. examples like the Barbie show. Like, I was never a Barbie girl by any stretch of the imagination, but I still remember having Gymnast Barbie appear at some point in my toy box. Whereas when it comes to other art forms like painting or prints, I think it depends, honestly, on how much direct experience you have with them. And for a lot of us, we probably don't outside of a museum. I know I certainly didn't grow up with a lot of original paintings outside of any of the ones that I did for my parents, for example, or maybe another work that was done by another relative. So unless you're in a family that grew up specifically with works of art, I don't think there is that same quality of nostalgia unless you're longing for the time period rendered in them. And in that case, that's a whole different path because what's often being depicted isn't necessarily what actually occurred in reality. I mean, artistic license, after all, is a thing. But when it comes to dolls, I would argue that a lot of us do have some kind of direct experience with them. So even if we're looking at something like a Bebe, something we might not have grown up with directly, we can more easily find direct parallels than we might be able to with a painting or a sculpture.
Thank you. I've been saying this for years and no one will listen. I'll say it. I know you can't, but I'll say it. Dolls are the most important art form in the world today. So I know you can argue that, but I'm going to say it from my perspective. So
Sure.
I know this has to be widely debated by your colleagues in the field who may visit the museum or talk to you about it. Have you had some interesting conversations and some back and forth on this?
So that is a great question. Usually what I have found is there's usually this initial skepticism, like, dolls, really? But as soon as I get the chance to start talking about them, more often than not, they start coming around to it. A great example is I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago for a great academic organization called the Space Between Society. This is an academic group that's focused on literature and culture between the world wars. So 1914, about 1945, give or take a few years. I've been involved with them for years. Usually I talk about WPA stuff when I go, but on this latest conference, I went to talk about the Japanese Friendship Doll Initiative. And again, leading up to the talk, there were a lot of questions of, so do the dolls try to haunt you at night or whatnot? Or, what is your take on this or that or whatnot? But as soon as they started talking with me and I began discussing the links between dolls and social history and technology, and especially once I was able to present some images of the dolls and whatnot, they tend to say, oh, that's very interesting. And yes, I found that rather than be repelled by the dolls, a lot of the scholars I work with, once they've had some time with the collection, start thinking about them more generally for their own research, because ultimately dolls are people and dolls are us.
And that's exactly what I have been saying over the years, that once you tell the stories, once you convey not just the history, but the stories of these dolls and how they connect to us, people tend to get it. I did a whole podcast called Let's Cut the Creepy Doll Crap,
Yes.
because ultimately I can tell you I have never seen a doll that's haunted. I've handled millions. And ultimately it stems, well, we all know the theory of uncanny valley, and I've talked about it in previous episodes. So it's kind of a little bit ingrained, but the reality is that I think a lot of it is they look at those eyes and they see us, and yet they have no soul. And the problem is because they don't know the stories. And once they know the stories and understand it, they have soul. They then can relate to them and they feel them. So this is really interesting hearing what some of the people are saying in the past. Now, I got to interject one thing. It's a little off topic, but you've mentioned it twice now in talking about your studies of WPA. So have you researched into the WPA dolls and studied some of these that were produced?
Oh, it's on my list of things to do. I learned about them at a conference a couple of years ago, and I haven't had a chance to dive into them more deeply yet. But yes, I am aware of the WPA dolls, and from what little I know, it's a fascinating history. And
it's
I can't wait
really
to get
fascinating. So every state had a sort of different genre that they would compose with these dolls, and they're very unique. The Wisconsin WPAs are some of my favorites, as a matter of fact. Yeah, it's a really interesting topic. I can imagine you one day doing an entire presentation and paper on this, and perhaps even a focus exhibit eventually at the Barrie Art Museum, because it's a really important topic. And there's a lot of collectors who specialize in them as well. So that's great. So getting back to dolls and the art form. So, and I wanted to mention too in this, because it was interesting when Carolyn Barrie was first building the museum, she had me come down to Old Dominion. I don't know if you know this story. She had me come down to Old Dominion University. Yeah. And she wanted me to do a talk to the board there regarding the dolls. And you're right that you mentioned that at first people kind of are a little bit confused, like dolls, and they don't get it. And when I got up there, my focus was exactly as you do, was conveying not, oh, look how pretty they are, but here's some stories and here's how they relate, how automatons can relate to robotics and relate to the first computer programming and theater and fashion dolls. You have a great opportunity at your university with fashion merchandising and how they are early examples of fashion merchandising. Once I was able to do that, you could see there was a far more spirit of connection to them and an understanding and respect. So, and this is something we talk about all the time to doll collectors, is stop telling people how beautiful they are. Start telling the stories of what they are. So I love that you're doing this in the art world, because this is a really important narrative to changing the perspective. So I'm curious because, we just touched on this. You are, in reality, I don't know what the exact wording is, but you're a university museum. So you're in a university setting at Old Dominion and in Norfolk, Virginia. And so I'm curious, what has been the reaction of the student body and younger generations coming in and seeing these pieces? And I'm sure you have talked to them and listened to them over the years of their thoughts on the dolls.
I found, again, great question. I have found that reactions really span the whole gamut. Naturally, the uncanny valley comes up quite a bit, and I attribute that largely to popular culture. Movies like the Child's Play series, Twilight Zone, all of that has taught us to be afraid of dolls, and that to be anything but means that you're odd somehow. But once you get past that initial veneer, there are quite a few students who are interested in dolls. So from my experiences, I found that the most immediate way to connect with students is, again, to reach out where they are in terms of asking, what kinds of dolls did you grow up with? And as soon as I start hearing names like Bratz or Barbie or whatnot, then I'm able to make connections with some of our older fashion dolls in terms of, well, here are their great-great-great-great-grandmothers, for example. One of my favorite encounters was a few months ago. One of the professors on campus reached out to me about bringing her students to see the automatons, because this was Intro to Communications and Critical Race Theory, I think was the class. And they wanted to see some of the Orientalist automatons in particular. So we pulled some of them out, we lined them up, and what was so fascinating was, initially the students, again, had their skeptical look on terms of, well, here we are looking at dolls, but I guess it gets us out of a classroom at least. And naturally, they had to pull out their phones and film everything for a second. But I'm not kidding when I say this, Stuart. Once they set down the phones, we activated the automatons, and they still have a pull. Those students were enthralled with them.
I see this all the time, and it is just a matter of connecting. And this is why the Barry Art Museum is so vital in this, in being this first museum that exposes people to these items. And automatons are a great gateway. You're exactly right. Fabulous gateway in exploring, because they have movement. They come to life, and they're very visual. They're theater. And so it's a great gateway. And then once you have that gateway, you lead them into the other subjects. And I love this. I know I've heard from Carolyn Berry, and she's told me that it's had incredible response with people visiting the doll gallery. It's been really popular from what I understand. Is that correct?
Yes, I would say I see this time and again where people come in initially to see the museum in general, or maybe they want to see the paintings and whatnot, and then they'll go upstairs to see the dolls. And some people are specifically going to see them. Others are accompanying friends and family or whatnot. And they'll be like, well, I'll be supportive and go in. And they'll come out afterwards saying, that was my favorite gallery.
I love this. I tell this story, and that's, again, the important takeaway and why the Barry Art Museum, for us, for doll people, for collectors, for historians in the doll subject, this is the most important venue in the world to properly expose the others to the stories. So you have your permanent collection, and I know you do some tweaking and rotating, and it originally was sort of a chronology, I believe, if I remember when I was working with Carolyn.
Yeah, initially.
Start of the museum, right. And you've kind of changed that vision a bit. And tell me a little bit about how the museum is constructed now, the doll gallery specifically.
Sure. So right now, the doll gallery follows a thematic rather than chronological organization. And I supervised this new layout. So after we wrapped up with Motion and Motion, Charlotte asked if I'd like to stay on for additional projects. And I said, sure, absolutely. And the first one was refreshing or reinterpreting the doll gallery with two objectives in mind. One was to create a layout that was a little less cluttered than what was in there before. So initially it opened chronologically. New dolls had been added over the years. So it was starting to take on a little bit more of the look of a traditional doll museum, which is fine, but that's not what the university was interested in. And that wasn't what the Barry Art Museum wanted to do. So it was partly for that, but also we wanted to create a more intentional temporary exhibition space within the doll gallery. Because starting in 2021, I believe, the museum had started doing rotating doll shows, beginning with Alan Scott Pate's great exhibition on Japanese dolls. But the way that show had been done was they carved out a space at the end of the gallery, so it felt a little bit improvised, and the museum wanted something that looked a little more intentional. So I know you and I walked through the gallery. I walked through it with Carolyn. I walked through with Susie over in education to get a variety of perspectives on what different stakeholders essentially were interested in within the doll collection. And then I started visiting other museum collections to think about layouts. Certainly I looked at doll installations, but more often than not, I was looking at art museums in terms of painting and sculpture. And I eventually settled on the idea of going with a thematic layout after visiting the Crystal Bridges Museum, because they do thematic layouts of their shows. And what I really liked was the opportunity to pair works from different geographies, time periods, and to get these different types of dialogues going that you might not have happen if you're strictly following a timeline from A to Z. So having settled on that, we tested out a few different ideas and we settled on 4 different themes: dolls and technology, dolls and fashion, dolls and art, and dolls in popular culture. We call it culture, but it's really popular culture. And we did that for a couple of reasons. One, we wanted themes that would appeal to students as well as collectors, and specifically students and visitors who might not be doll people per se. It was a way of saying, look, dolls do relate to your life. You use technology, so do dolls. You're into fashion, so are dolls, and so on. We also picked those themes because we wanted themes that were flexible enough that we would be able to rotate a variety of dolls in and out of the space for conservation reasons. Dolls, as you know, they're light sensitive. Their textiles need time to rest. So we wanted a space that was flexible enough to have the dolls move in and out as they needed to for resting purposes. And then finally, we put that rotating gallery space in the center of the gallery with these 4 different themes rotating around it. So you can visit one of these modules, as I put them, or you can go into the temporary show. You're not bound by any particular entry or exit. It's really up to the visitors to decide where they want to go.
That's one of the things that makes me crazy at a museum. I was recently at one and I was like entering the exhibit and I'm like, well, wait a minute, which way do I go? I get that I'm going to get the full development of the theme here. And so I love that you can enter from anywhere and you get the same experience.
Yeah, that was a lesson I learned from the Roswell Museum in New Mexico, because that museum has had many different additions added over the years as money became available. And because it was not necessarily planned the way the Barry Art Museum's upcoming expansion is, all the galleries have multiple entry and exit points. So when we were doing the Herd Wyeth show, for example, in Doylestown at the Michener Art Museum, it did follow a chronological format because the gallery had one entrance. I couldn't do that at the Roswell Museum because every gallery had multiple entry points. So I had to rethink it and then ultimately went with a more thematic layout. So that previous lesson, along with seeing what I did at Crystal Bridges, really informed how I approached the dolls.
I like it. It's a much more studied approach. And I mean, the easy route is to go to the chronology. And,
Sure.
Even collectors in their homes could consider that. But I think about it, and dolls play off each other, and figurative art can play off of each other, not just in the posing of them, because a lot of collectors today love vignettes. And they'll have different styles of pieces, but they play off well in how they interact in the display. But the same thing can be said from the historical concept of how a Barbie and a French fashion can play off of each other very well in the idea of theme.
Absolutely. And that was what we wanted was, again, yes, it was practical, but it was also an opportunity to bring a sense of play into the space in terms of why not have a French bébé and a Barbie interact with each other.
Right. Right. I love this. This is incredible. Now, you do as well focus exhibits throughout the past few years. You've done, I know, one on Madame Alexander, which is an incredible, important story in American entrepreneurship and in women's studies as well.
Oh, yes.
And then you did one on French bébés, which we all know, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, when we talk about Carolyn in a few minutes. But bebés were Carolyn's first passion. So it was a must for the museum at some point to show her love of the bébé doll and talk about that. And right now you're doing one called Carved Couture, which focuses on 17th and 18th century wood dolls. Incidentally, really connects to your region because the whole history of colonial America, a lot of it is steeped in Virginia. And so it gives a really great, I think, local concept, too, of that. And I think some of the pieces you have are from colonial Williamsburg as well. So what is the goal of these focus exhibits that you do? And these are not large-scale exhibits like you think of in a museum. It's a very small room, which I love, that you walk into, and you have, 14, 15 objects typically, something along those lines?
I would say not even that. It's probably closer to 6 to 10.
Okay.
But you're right. They're intimate shows. What I love about doing these focus doll shows is it's an opportunity to do a closer look at a type of doll or a doll maker or a doll story without having to commit to the full scale of the exhibition. It has an intimacy that visitors can take in as much or as little time as they need and still have plenty of energy to explore the rest of the museum.
I like that. It also, I'm thinking about it too, and I never realized before, it doesn't overwhelm people. So they get the basic concept, and if there's a fascination and a connection that they realize, they now have the foundation to go home and say, I want to read more about these. And you've given them the start.
Yeah, that's how I like to see it, as a launching point. Comprehensive exhibitions with hundreds of objects are great when you're in the right mood for them. But for a lot of visitors, again, especially visitors who may be encountering dolls for the first time, they don't necessarily want to see all the dolls at once or the entire story in all of its detail. So we're just providing a foundation for them to continue exploring as they see fit.
That's great. And then now you have also integrated dolls into other exhibits you've done because there was a connection in the story. Remind me of one exhibit that you did that had a couple of dolls in there.
So let's see. Of the shows we've done over the years, of course, Motion Emotion had the automatons, and that paired the automatons with different examples of robotics and whatnot. I will say in the doll gallery itself, we do integrate other pieces from the collection in there. So we have examples of glass that usually rotate in or out every few months or so. We've also got some wonderful paintings in there. There's a George Bellows and a George Lukes that show young girls with their dolls. So we've done that. And then, of course, there was Théâtre de la Mode, which featured some extant examples of those dolls paired with Karen Lamont's beautiful glass sculpture.
These are great examples of when you do an exhibit, you see the use of the doll to come into that exhibit. Even though it's nothing related really to dolls, there is a connection that you can bring some of the pieces in, which further, I think, explores what we were talking about much earlier, and that is the connectivity of art and dolls in different themes. So this is great, and I love everything that you're doing, Sara. You're a true visionary in how you've approached the doll gallery there, and I'm just so excited for the future and what you're going to be doing. Now, right now, you have the largest, actually, doll-specific exhibit that you've ever done before at Barre Art Museum, and one that I was encouraging you to do for years because it's an easy gateway. It's an easy path in connecting pop culture, especially your student body who can all relate to this. And you launched an exhibit that focuses on the history of Barbie and how it relates to society. Can you tell me how has that been going and what's been the response on the Barbie exhibit?
Oh, the response has been so enthusiastic. It really has, Stuart. So a little bit of background on the show. We worked on the exhibition with Bradley Justice Yarborough, who's provided a lot of the technical information, the historical information, as well as specific dolls in the show. But what's really made this exhibition so wonderful for the community is how much of the community is actually in it. So this probably won't surprise you. Maybe it will. But we have found every time we've done a focused doll exhibition, there has always been this really robust local response. And we will find out about these incredible collections right in our neighborhood after the show opens.
Okay.
Not the best timing. So
yes.
Knowing that we got that kind of a response to Madame Alexander, to Martha Chase, and so forth, I started thinking several months ago, like, we need to do something to anticipate Barbie because the response to this show is going to be huge. This is a doll that everyone knows. So the Barrie Art Museum team, we all came up with the idea of doing a community call. So we shared it over public radio and over email and all other sources, where we invited members of the Hampton Roads communities to send examples of their dolls via photo for potential inclusion in the show. We had a specific list of dolls we were looking for in terms of, if you have the 1967 Twist and Turn Barbie, for example, feel free to send an image. But we also opened it up more generally to whatever interesting doll you have, go ahead, send it along, and we'll see what we can do with it. And those community submissions really ended up shaping the content of the show, because they are there alongside Bradley's examples and other examples from collectors. And one of the most prominent examples of how these local submissions shaped the show was through a wall called Barbie on Campus. So this was not part of the exhibition originally. But as we were going through the submissions, we all noticed that a lot of them were coming from ODU faculty. And they were boxed dolls. Nothing against boxed dolls, but we only had room for so many dolls in boxes on the timeline that we were putting together. Most of them were going to be unboxed dolls that we could pose and whatnot. But we all came up with the idea we don't really want to leave them out. So what if we just make a new section? So this wall is just all the dolls that you'll find from ODU faculty and students. And what's fascinating is how they span all these different interests. You've got the eco-warrior set Barbie. You've got working woman Barbie. You have Jell-O fun Barbie. It reflects all of these different interests. And how do they relate to one another? They're all from ODU.
So you brought in a very personal, local slant to it as well, not just something that was broad. And so people could really connect to it from a personal perspective. I love this. This is great.
That's been one of the most fascinating things to me, is seeing Barbie, arguably more than any other doll, has this cross-generational appeal that I haven't seen anywhere else. And during the opening especially, I saw grandmothers and mothers and daughters and granddaughters all bonding over this timeline. But what was so interesting to me was that they were all feeling nostalgically about different dolls, because they grew up with different examples. So the grandmothers remembered the dolls from the 60s and 70s. But then visitors my age were thinking about dolls from the 90s. And then you have the Gen Zers, our gallery hosts, who remember the 3D animated movies that I didn't know existed until a couple months ago. We all have... Oh,
yeah, it's a huge thing. And
oh, my gosh, it's enormous.
And they're on TikTok, reliving, doing cosplay with Prince and the Pauper Barbies. And telling that whole story of their youth. And this is one of the interesting things about the marketplace. You see it from a museum perspective. We see it from the market perspective, and how a Barbie auction can have 3 generations there that are all interacting with different time periods typically, and it directly relates to nostalgia. So what's that old saying, all politics are local? I guess you could say in some sense all dolls are local and personal to how you connect with them. And that's why I always say nostalgia and your youth is the gateway into, and this is, I think, an important message of why the Barbie exhibit within an art museum is so vitally important, because you need to meet people where they are. And you're a university museum. You're open to the public, obviously, but you're in a university setting. Meeting people where they are, in your particular case, would be Barbie is the natural. That's the gateway. It then connects them further into the history, where I believe you have a French fashion doll or two on display there as well, showing how that really influenced the later development of Barbie. So all of these things brings your general audience, your local, in quotations, audience, into the concept of seeing Barbie and then expanding from there.
Oh, absolutely. And you're right. To clarify, the show's actually divided in half. The Gateway is a replica of the 1979 Dream House. Our theater program folks built this human-scaled dream house for us in the middle of the gallery. And one side is all Barbie, but the other side are all of Barbie's ancestors. So we have French fashion dolls. We've got Madame Alexander. We have Simon and Halbig. Again, just demonstrating that these are the Barbies of their time. They might look old-fashioned to you, but in their time, they were on the bleeding edge of fashion the way Barbie is now.
I'm going to steal that term, Barbie's ancestors. I love it. It's great. It's a great one. You've given me all sorts of new terms today, Sarah, that I want to use out here on the road. So I want to talk a little bit about Carolyn Barrie, because I've known Carolyn for many, many years. And I knew her back in the day when she was just a doll collector. And, the dolls lived in her home. And she loved her bébés and delved into a few other things here and there along the lines of French fashions and others. But she's an amazing story because this woman is one of the most humble and I should mention as well, her husband, Richard Berry, too, as he's been very encouraging in this process of the doll aspect of it. And of course, together, they have given this incredible gift to Old Dominion and to the community of Hampton Roads and in this museum. But I want to talk about Carolyn because it's primarily going to be doll people that are listening to this. And I think it's an incredible story of how I call it Carolyn's courage, that she was willing to take this doll collection of hers, not only from an emotional standpoint, remove it from her house, which for a doll collector, that's a very big step emotionally. Now, I realize she can go visit them at the museum, but it's not the same. So doing that and then also having that courage to break through the noise that you typically would hear from art historians in the past and museum boards that, well, dolls are not really art and they don't really belong here, but she pushed through it. So tell me your thoughts on Carolyn's vision and how this has contributed to the gallery as well and your takeaways of Carolyn.
Well, first off, you described me as a visionary, but I would argue that Carolyn's the visionary in terms of imagine a museum where dolls and paintings live together as art. That is so unusual. As I'd mentioned, it's like, yes, you have institutions like Shelburne and other museums that do have all of those different media, but they very much live in their own buildings and are interpreted in their own ways. The dolls do not mingle with the paintings and so forth. So to envision an art museum that approaches dolls as art, that's the visionary idea to me. And you're also right in that Carolyn is one of the most humble people I've met. So I went to my first UFDC convention last year in Kansas City, and I got to travel with Carolyn for a few days throughout this experience. And within the doll world, she would hate to hear me say this, but she's a celebrity. She's renowned, but she never lets that on when we're interacting with her when she's at the museum.
It's incredible to watch. She astounds me as a person. And I want to say a few things again about her husband, Richard, who he has been so supportive, not only through the years of her as a collector in really pushing her to engage in something she loves and giving her the validation that I always say is so important to a collector from a spouse to feel validation and in what they're doing as a protector of history. So, Richard is fantastic as well. And the two of them together have given this incredible gift to the world, not just to doll collectors, but to everyone to see the concept and narrative, as I said before, of dolls as art. So tell me, what are some of the long-term plans for the doll gallery? I believe that in August, you're doing a museum expansion, and how does that impact the doll gallery?
I'm so excited to tell you about this because by the time we finish this expansion, Stuart, it's going to be a new museum. We are essentially doubling the museum space. Not only in terms of administrative spaces, we're increasing our collection storage, offices, and whatnot, but especially our gallery spaces. So moving forward into this expansion, we are going to be increasing the doll's presence within the museum because we are adding a new permanent collection gallery that's larger than what we have right now. And then right next to it, we're also adding a new temporary gallery for the doll shows. So they will move out of the permanent space and into their own galleries so they can have more space to delve into these topics a bit more deeply without still being overwhelming on the scale of a really large changing show. So we'll be able to dive even more deeply into the doll collection and do these really engaging, intellectually rigorous shows that connect with viewers on a variety of levels.
Like WPA dolls.
Exactly. That is definitely on my list of, my long-term list of shows to do.
For you, it's a natural.
Oh,
that
yes.
is a natural, yeah. So that is incredible. So this is really great news for doll collectors because I know a lot of people in the beginning kind of imagined, they're like, oh, well, they started off with this big doll gallery, but over time, it will start getting smaller and smaller. But no, folks, people are responding to this. It is a great success, and it is going to be expanding. So I'm excited, and I know doll collectors around the world should be excited, and I believe it will help, again, continuing that message to the others. So in July, we're having this discussion in June of 2025, but in July, in just a few weeks away, there's going to be a big, almost, I want to call it coming out moment for Barrie Art Museum from the whole doll world. And Norfolk is getting its taste of doll collector mania throughout the city, because we've got nearly 1,000 people coming in really from Europe, Asia, all over the United States, everywhere for the National Convention of Doll Collectors, UFDC. And there's going to be a number of events. It'll be at the museum. And what are you hoping for some of the people listening that are coming to the museum at the convention and seeing it for the first time? What are you hoping their takeaway will be?
I hope that they'll see how seriously we take their passion in terms of what you collect matters. We understand that, and we want to present it, interpret it, work with you in such a way that other visitors will understand it too. So if they can pick up on that, if we are able to convey that, then we will have succeeded as a museum.
And that's what I think will absolutely happen in July when people see the museum for the first time, is they will realize that you are telling not just the story of the dolls, but you are giving validation and respect to the history of the dolls in a way that collectors can really appreciate and relate to. So, Sara, with that, what can collectors around the world who are relying on the Barrie Art Museum as being this incredible experiment in relating dolls to the general public as works of art, what can they do to help you?
So I would say the most immediate thing you can always do is tell your friends about us. Tell us that we're here. Come visit us in Norfolk if you can. If you can't, visit our website. We always have 3D tours that people can visit and be able to visit the spaces that way. So tell them about us. Come visit us. And if you have dolls, absolutely, we're always listening in terms of potential donations and so forth. But most immediately, just getting the word out always helps.
And even just getting a basic membership to the museum. If you're not living in the area, that's okay. Just get a membership. This is a very small amount that it costs each year to become a member, and it really helps the museum. And it will be great for you in that you'll receive notifications of special events and some unique seminars that you'll have access to that are members only. And it's showing your support of Barrie Art Museum, which all they have done for the doll world, it is the least we can do today to give back our support and to encourage this to continue on. And I want to say, Sara, that I am just so excited for how you have come into the museum and given this breath of fresh air from an art historian perspective and are helping to connect dolls as works of art. And please continue on. I know you don't like the term visionary for you, and Carolyn certainly is as well, but you are a visionary in this, and you are a great advocate out there in the general world of education and art history in telling this story. So thank you for everything. Thank you for being here today and spending time with us and telling us about the Barrie Art Museum.
Well, thank you, Stuart, for having me on here. It's been a pleasure, and I just want to give a shout out to my fellow team members at the Barrie, because it's never one person who does it, and everybody who works at the museum gets it when it comes with the dolls. We know how important they are, and everybody contributes to presenting and interpreting them, and I'm just happy to represent the institution today.
I love it so much. You are wonderful for saying that, and I have met everybody there, and truly, it is a great team, and people really get it. And thank you, and thanks for coming here today and talking with us, and I know you'll be greeting everybody in July who's attending the National Convention. If you haven't signed up for the National Convention, you still can, and even if you're not signed up for the tours, the museum will be open all week during conventions. So Wednesday, yes, Thursday, Friday, and I believe Saturday as well, you'll be able to still come in.
Absolutely. And I'll just say right now, if you aren't able to get on one of those special tours, we do have staff and gallery hosts available all week who are willing to give tours. So we are here to serve you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sara. Thanks so much. And thank you to the Barrie Art Museum for everything they're doing in the world of dolls.
And again, Stuart, thank you for having me on.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, everybody. And I hope you enjoyed this episode. We'll see you next week from somewhere out on the road through America and more great conversation on doll collecting.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Curious Collector. The Curious Collector is hosted by Stuart Holbrook and produced by Tammy Trujillo. We invite you to follow us on social media and feel free to leave any questions you have for Stuart on Facebook at Stuart Holbrook-Theriaults or follow the Theriault Company Facebook page. And you can stay up to date with the latest auctions and events at theriaults.com. We'll talk to you on the next episode of The Curious Collector.